Welcome to your regular dose of pain. Wag na tayo magpatumpik-tumpik pa, let's just get straight to the point. We are going to define a few terms that you will often encounter in a lot of parasitology textbooks, in your literature, in your lectures, so you might as well get to know them, so that anytime these come up in your exams, you guys are on the same page. Una sa lahat, what is parasitology? It is the study of parasitism. And what is parasitism? It is a symbiotic relationship between a parasite and the host. This parasite lives in or on the host, and it lives at the expense of the host. The parasite gets most, if not all, of the benefits from the relationship. Free food, place to live, evasion from predation, free transportation. And then the host is the one that's negatively affected in that relationship. Siya yung nagpo-provide ng pagkain, tirahan, transportation. You will also hear the word host pertaining to organisms that don't necessarily have a relationship with a parasite, but with a different kind of organism, say a phoront. A phoront is an organism that attaches to the host. So in this case, the host is simply a mechanical carrier for the phoront. Classic example would be the remora and how it just attaches itself underneath the whale or a stingray or a larger marine organism. In that sense, the host isn't necessarily always negatively affected, and the host isn't always used in the context solely of parasitology. Meron din namang host ng party TV show. Tama na, please! Unahin na natin yung parasites. You can classify them in a bunch of different ways. How long they're associated with a particular host.
So they can either be temporary or permanent.
If they're temporary parasites, they're just there for a short while and then they're gone. Mosquitoes, fleas, ticks, bed bugs.
Permanent parasites stay with their hosts for a majority, if not all, of their lives. Parasites can also be defined based on their need for a host, as in whether it's optional or required.
Facultative parasites can live on their own, but if they happen to end up within an organism, they sort of adopt a parasitic lifestyle. Nigleria. So it's actually a free-living protozoan, but if you happen to get it into your system, then bam, you get Pam, and then Brenda. You're gonna learn more about that in the future episode.
Obligate parasites cannot complete their life cycle without a host. They will at some point in their life need to be parasitic.
If that's not your cup of tea, you can also classify parasites based on where you actually find them. So they could either be ectoparasites, which means they're just on the host, or they are endoparasites, which means they are inside the host. There are also other ways to sort of describe parasites. For example, you have accidental parasites. They end up in a host that really isn't supposed to be their host. Uy, oh my god, di naman ako taga rito ah. You will also hear terms like protolean parasites, in which the immature stages of that organism are the only stages that are parasitic. You may have also heard of parasitoids. They're the type of organisms that eventually kill their host. And another type of parasite is the hyperparasite. It's a parasite inside a parasite. The malaria in a mosquito, or the tapeworm in a flea. Yung parasite dun sa loob ng parasite is a hyperparasite. These descriptors, the way to classify these parasites, they're not mutually exclusive. A parasite could be an endoparasite and a hyperparasite at the same time. It could also be an accidental parasite. You can use as many of these terms to describe just one particular species of parasite. As long as it's correct and as long as it applies, then yes. Hosts also come in different types. And usually this has something to do with how they are useful to the parasite. So this is always remember that this is from the perspective of the parasite. The definitive host is the host in which the mature reproductive stages of the parasite are. And that's also the host where those parasites reproduce. Yung definitive host, parang siya yung motel. Doon nangyayari yung kababalagan. The intermediate host is the one that contains the non-mature asexual stages of that parasite. There is some development that may occur, but there's no sexual reproduction going on within that host. The paratenic or transport host is, from the name itself, transport host. Carrier lang siya. Tagadala lang siya. This is the host in which the parasite really does not develop. It just sort of stays there and it remains viable, ready to infect the next intermediate host or the definitive host. The reservoir host is a non-human organism that carries the parasite. Meron din tayong tinatawag na vectors. Sila yung tagabitbit ng parasite. And they're broadly classified into either biological vectors or mechanical vectors. vectors. If you are a biological vector, then you are very much needed in the life cycle of the organism. It means kailangan ka talaga ng parasite para mabuhay siya. For example, in malaria, the mosquito is actually the definitive host. Micro and macro gametocyte ng malaria, dun yun sa mosquito nagtatagpo at chumotsorba. In the same case, the mosquito is the vector. So again, remember, terms not mutually exclusive. Pwedeng vector ka, ikaw rin yung definitive host, or pwedeng vector ka, tas ikaw yung intermediate host. But in those cases na kailangan ka dun sa life cycle ng parasite, then you are a biological vector. Mechanical vectors are not necessary for the parasite to continue its life cycle. Pero nabibit-bit sila. Mga langaw, ipis, daga, maraming dumidikit sa kanila and then they shed stuff into the environment.
Yan nabasa pawis.
For parasites, they also have a life cycle, of course, being living organisms. The life cycle showcases the key developmental stages of your parasite. There has to be a way for the organism to continue living, and that's what the life cycle will show you. Life cycles come in two main types. Parasites with direct life cycles only really require one host, whereas those with indirect life cycles will require more than one host. Now, in that life cycle, if we look at it from a pathological point of view, there will be certain stages in that parasite's life cycle that, from a medical perspective, we would also define them as the infective stage, the pathogenic stage, and the diagnostic stage. The infective stage is the life stage of the parasite that finds its way into the host's body. Depende rin kung sino ba yung host. Dun sa intermediate host, iba yung infective stage dun compared dun sa infective stage sa definitive host. The pathogenic stage will be the life stage of the parasite that causes symptoms. The diagnostic stage will indicate the presence of that parasite in the host via the diagnostic sample. And the diagnostic sample is the sample that you will collect from the host. GIFS, dugo, tissue biopsy, so on and so forth. Kunyari sa GIFS, tas may nakita kang parasite. Kung ano man yung stage na nakita nyo dun sa GIFS na yon, in your diagnostic sample, that is the diagnostic stage. These days, with PCR, nucleic acid amplification nga, kung lumabas yung DNA ng organism, ng parasite, di alam mo na meron ka na ng parasite na. Siyempre, iba pa rin yung pag nakita mo talaga siya, di ba? Na siya talaga yun. And more or less, yan lang naman talaga yung general terminologies that can apply for all the parasites that we will be discussing. But there are still other terms specific to certain parasite groups. So I think it would be much better if we discuss and define those terms when we discuss those parasites as well. Miracidium, sporocyst, Redia, Metasarcaria, Sarcaria, di ba ang dami? Sporogony, Gametogony, Merogony, ganyan, Schizogony, Bradyzoid, Tachyzoid, Merozoid. Pati yung mga yon, kailangan lang din nating i-define para maintindihan nyo sila. If we talk about them this early on, makakalimutan nyo rin naman eh. Tapos babalikan nyo pa tong video na to. Ano na nga ba yung sinabi ni ma'am? Let's just add a few more other things about parasites, at least general characteristics. For one, how are they transmitted? You will hear terminologies like orofecal route, oral, fecal. So, kinain mo yung tae. Hindi naman talaga, but you may have eaten something that was contaminated by poop. Pwedeng uminom ka ng tainted water, may nakain kang something contaminated, tapos i-jebs mo sa environment. Ang typical na mga orofecal transmission, these are intestinal parasites, but the ones that live in the GI tract. There are also sexually transmitted parasites. Trichomonas, yung mga pubic lice, yung tinatawag nating crabs, direct penetration to the skin. Nasa lupa lang siya, tapos naglakad ka, nakapaa, hindi ka nakachinelas, pwedeng pasukin na ng uod yung balat mo. Vector-borne transmission. So ito po yung mga yan, dala ng lamok, dala ng flea, usually arthropods yung nagke-carry sa kanila. So sana naalala nyo pa from your invertebrate zoology. These are some of the common ways that parasites are transmitted from one host to another, thereby perpetuating their life cycle. You have a parasite. Are you infected or infested? If the parasite is an endoparasite, then you are infected. If the parasite is an ectoparasite, then you are infested. Tandaan nyo, endoparasite, infected. Pag nasa labas, S, infested. Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na meron kang infestation ng amoeba. No! You have an amoebic infection. You cannot be infected by lice. You are infested by lice. Speaking of infection sites, where will you typically find parasites? Think about it. What do they need from a host? They need nutrients. Ano ba yung organs na rich in nutrients? Intestines, liver, kidneys, blood. Aside from nutrients, they also need respiratory gases. Kaya nandun din sila sa blood. And you might also find some of them sa lungs. Organs ng katawan natin na matakaw sa nutrients. For example, the brain, the eyes. Typically, the ones that are in the muscles are actually dormant in terms of immune response. Hindi naman din masyadong pinupuntahan ng muscle. Yan yung taguan nilang lugar. Skin, particularly for ectoparasites, di ba? Hanggang skin lang naman talaga ang inaabot nila, but they're actually after your blood.
What we've mentioned so far are just a few examples of specific organs that parasites tend to inhabit. But if you want to be a bit more general, you can say that if they inhabit the cavity or the lumen of an organ, or say the coelom, the body cavity, these parasites are known as coelozoic. If they inhabit the tissues themselves, they're like embedded in the tissue, they feed on the host tissues, then they are histozoic.
In order for a parasite to be successful, it has to have more or less a combination of certain traits. Typically, parasites are baby-making factories. Ang bilis nilang dumami. High reproductive output. Baby, like boom! And that's mainly because, for one, if you're living in the host, you don't know where you're gonna end up. If you're an endoparasite and you're releasing eggs, you don't know the destiny of those eggs. Will all of those ever make it to the next host? The more entries, the more chances of winning. Another is they typically have certain anatomical modifications that make them more effective at finding and staying in or on their hosts. For example, tapeworms, actually flatworms in general, with their suckers, they're usually in your digestive system. So of course, digestive system, there's a lot of peristaltic motion moving the food down the tube. So yung worm, para hindi siya matangay ng peristaltic motion, edi syempre, needs to stick. Yun, dikit siya dun sa intestinal wall para hindi ako makakalagkad away. There's a lot more, and we'll get to know them as we get to know these different parasites. In order to be a successful parasite, you'll also need to have some sort of really impeccable immune system evasion, especially if you are an endoparasite. Remember, you're living in a host that is also trying to stay alive. The host will have to defend itself from foreign pathogens. As a parasite, you're also a fucking pathogen. Kung ikaw yung invader, kailangan marunong kang umiwas-iwas. Otherwise, wala. Mamaya-maya, papatayin ka lang nung mga white blood cells, or mamaya-maya, ifa-flush out ka lang nung system. You have to outnumber your host. This is also tied in with the high reproductive output. You reproduce way fast, and so you outnumber your host. One organism, one host, can have so many different parasites of different species, and sometimes many individuals of the same species. Bahay ka na ng parasite. Pwede kang condominium, ang daming residente. Pwede kang mansion, pa isa-isa lang. You are most likely smaller than the host. Because if you are bigger than your host, that means you're a predator. Both predation and parasitism. One organism is positively affected, another is negatively affected. The main difference is the size. Which is why you will read in the book, parasites are sometimes called micro-predators. Parasites manifest themselves in a host through physical injury or physical trauma. As in, nagkaroon ng cyst yung muscle mo, nagkaroon ng cyst yung brain mo, nagkaroon ng abscess dun sa liver. Another is nutrient deficiency. The nutrients are siphoned to the parasites instead of the host. Common dito mga bulate. Kumain yung bata para pakainin lang yung alaga niyang bulate. And then napapansin nyo, parang wow, bakit ang laki ng tiyan mo? Parang lagi ka namang busog, pero bakit hindi ka tumatangkad, hindi ka lumalaki? Toxicity. The parasite is also a living organism. Like any other tenant or any other resident in a home, it's going to eat, it's going to shit. So sometimes the waste products of these parasites are toxic to the body. And so they can elicit an immune response. Or again, toxins that can actually like poison your system. Blood loss. That's because there are certain parasites that actually feed on the blood. That also sort of affects nutrient uptake. Because if you have less blood, so that means less oxygen transport to the tissues in your body. Also, the nutrients in the blood that came from the food, napunta na rin sa parasite, so wala nang napunta sa'yo. As a host, yun yung mga possible consequences. There are so many ways to study parasites depending on your level of comfort and your level of familiarity. Iba-iba yung itsura nila, iba-iba yung scientific name nila. These are the common patterns that you will observe as you study these different parasites. Sana nakatulong po ito. Pasensya na kung medyo mahaba.
At ang daming unnecessary jokes.
Again, this is just a study guide for you. Kahit paano, meron kayong naririnig na voice inside your head helping you a little bit with the terms and maybe some of the shit that you need to remember for your exams, okay? So I will see you in your next dose of pain.